near the desert, near those hills from which stone was quarried to build the statues of former kings. I write it because wine is bitter to my tongue, because I have lost my pleasure in women, and because neither gardens nor fish pools delight me any more. I have driven away the singers, and the sound of pipes and strings is torment to my ear. Therefore, I write this, I, Sinuhe, who make no use of my wealth, my golden cups, my ebony, ivory, and myrrh. They have not been taken from me. Slaves still fear my rod. Guards bow their heads and stretch out their hands at knee level before me. But bounds have been set to my walking, and no ships can put in through the surf of these shores. Never again shall I smell the smell of black earth on a night in spring. In lands. This was but a childish notion of hers. She hoped that I, too, would always run from danger and avoid misfortune. But the priests of Ammon hold that a name is an omen, and it may be that mine brought me peril and adventure and sent me into foreign lands. It made me a sharer in dreadful secrets, secrets of kings and their wives, secrets that may be the bearers of death, and at the last my name made me a fugitive and an exile. Yet I should be as childish as poor Kippa to fancy that a name can influence one's destiny. Would it not have been the same if I had been called Kepru or Kaphron or Moses? So I believe, yet Sinuhe was indeed exiled, whereas Heg, the son of the falcon, was crowned as harem head with a red and white crown, to be king over the upper and lower kingdoms. As to the significance of names, therefore, each must judge for himself. Each in his own faith will find solace against the evils and reverses of this life. I was born in the reign of the great King Amenhotep III, and in the same year as that one who desired to live by truth and whose name may no longer be named because it is accursed, though at the time nothing of this was known. There was great rejoicing at the palace when he was born, and the king brought many sacrifices to the great temple of Ammon that he had built. The people also were glad, not knowing what was to come. The royal consort Talia had until then hoped vainly for a son, though she had been consort for 22 years, and her name was written beside that of the king in the temples and upon the statues. Therefore, he whose name may no longer be named was proclaimed heir with elaborate ceremonial as soon as the priests had performed the circumcision. He was not born until the spring in the sowing season, whereas I had come the previous autumn when the floods stood at their highest. The day of my birth is unknown, for I came drifting down the Nile in a little reed boat daubed with pitch, and my mother Kippa found me among the reeds on the shore close by her own doorstep. The swallows had just returned and were twittering above me, but I lay so still that she believed me dead. She brought me to her house and warmed me by the charcoal fire and blew into my mouth until I whimpered. My father Senmut came back from visiting his patients, carrying 2 ducks and a bushel of flour. When he heard me crying, he thought Kippa had adopted a kitten and was about to rebuke her, but my mother said, "It is not a cat, I have a son. Rejoice, Senmut my husband, for a son has been born to us." My father called her an idiot and was angry until she showed me to him, and then he was moved by my helplessness. So they adopted me as their own child and even put it about among the neighbors that Kippa had borne me. This was foolish, and I do not know how many believed her. But Kippa kept the reed boat that brought me and hung it up in the roof, above my bed. My father took his best copper bowl to the temple and had me registered in the book of births as his own son born of Kippa, but the circumcision he did himself. For he was a doctor and feared the priests' knives because they left infected wounds. He did not let the priests touch me. Also he may have wanted to save money, for a poor people's doctor is not a wealthy man. I cannot, of course, recall these things, but my parents have told me of them so often and in such unvarying phrases that I must believe them and have no reason to suppose they lead. Throughout my childhood I never doubted that they were my parents, and no sadness darkened those years. They did not tell me the truth until my boy's locks were shorn and I became a youth. They told me then because they feared and honored the gods, and my father did not want me to live a lie my whole life through. But who I was, whence I came, and who my parents were I never learned, though, for reasons I shall speak of later, I believe I know. One thing is certain, I was not the only one to be carried down the river in a pitched reed boat. Thebes with its palaces and its temples was a big city, and the mud hovels of the poor clustered thickly about the statelier buildings. In the time of the great pharaohs Egypt had brought many nations under its sway, and with power and wealth came altered customs. Foreigners came to Thebes, merchants and craftsmen built temples there to their own gods. Great was the splendor and wealth of the temples and the palaces, great also the poverty outside the walls. Many poor people put their children out, many a rich wife, whose husband was away on his travels, abandoned the proof of her adultery to the river. Perhaps I was the son of a seaman's wife who had deceived her husband with some Syrian merchant. Perhaps, as I had not been circumcised, I was some foreigner's child. When my hair was cut and my mother had put it away in a little wooden box with my first sandals, I looked long at the reed boat she showed me. The struts were yellowed and broken and sooty with smoke from the brazier. It was tied with fowler's knots, but that was all it could tell me of my parentage. It was then that my heart felt its first wound. With the approach of age the soul flies like a bird back to the days of childhood. Now those days shine bright and clear in my memory until it seems as if everything then must have been better, lovelier than in the world of today. In this rich and poor do not differ, for there is surely none so destitute but his childhood shows some glint of happiness when he remembers it in age. My father Senmut lived upstream from the temple walls, in a squalid, noisy quarter. Near his house lay the big stone wharves where the Nile boats discharged their cargoes, and in the narrow alleyways were the seamen and merchants, taverns and the brothels to which the wealthy also came, borne on chairs from the inner city. Our neighbors were tax collectors, barge masters, non-commissioned officers, and a few priests of the 5th grade. Like my father, they belonged to the more respected part of the population, rising above it as a wall rises above the surface of the water. Our house, therefore, was spacious in comparison with the mud huts of the very poor that huddled sadly along the narrow alleys. We had even a garden a few paces long with a sycamore in it that my father had planted. The garden was fenced from the street by acacia bushes, and for a pool we had a stone trough that contained water only at flood time. There were 4 rooms to the house, and in one of them my mother prepared our food, which we ate on a veranda opening out of my father's surgery. Twice a week a woman came to help my mother clean the house, for Kippa was very cleanly, and once a week a washerwoman fetched our linen to her wash place on the river bank. In this rowdy quarter, where there were many foreigners, a quarter whose degradation was revealed to me only as I grew out of childhood, my father and his neighbors upheld tradition and all venerable customs. At a time when among even the aristocrats of the city these customs lapsed, he and his class continued rigidly to represent the Egypt of the past in their reverence for the gods, their purity of heart, and selflessness. It seemed as if they desired to dissociate themselves by their behavior from those with whom they were obliged to live and work. But why speak now of what I only later understood? Why not rather remember the gnarled trunk of the sycamore, and the soughing of the leaves when I sought shelter at its foot from the scorching sun, and my favorite toy, the wooden crocodile that snapped its jaws and showed its red gullet when I pulled it along the paved street on a string? The neighbors' children would gather to stare at it in wonder. I won many a honey sweetmeat, many a shiny stone and snippet of copper wire by letting others drag it along and play with it. Only children of high rank had such toys as a rule, but my father was given it by the palace carpenter, whom he had cured of a boil that prevented him from sitting down. In the morning my mother would take me with her to the vegetable market. She never had many purchases to make, Yet she could spend a water measure's time choosing a bunch of onions and the whole of every morning for a week if it were a matter of choosing new shoes. By the way she talked, one might have judged her to be rich and concerned merely with having the best. If she did not buy all that took her fancy, why, then it was because she wished to bring me up in thrifty ways. She would declare, "It is not the man with silver and gold who is rich, but the man who is content with little," so she would assure me, while her poor old eyes dwelt longingly upon the brig. Colored woolen stuffs from Sidon and Byblos, as fine and light as down. Her brown, work-hardened hands caressed the ostrich feathers and the ornaments of ivory. It was all vanity, she told me and herself, but the child's mind rebelled against these precepts. I longed to own a monkey that put its arm about its master's neck, or a brilliant feathered bird that shrieked Syrian and Egyptian words. And I should have had nothing against gold chains and gilded sandals. It was not until much later that I realized how dearly poor old Kippa longed to be rich. Being but the wife of a poor physician, she stilled her yearnings with stories. Before we fell asleep at night she would tell me in a low voice all the tales she knew. She told of Sinuhe and of the shipwrecked man who returned from the Serpent King with countless riches, of gods and evil spirits, of sorcerers, and of the pharaohs of old. My father often murmured at this and said she was filling my head with nonsense, but when it was evening and he had begun to snore, she would continue, as much for her own pleasure as for mine. I remember those stifling summer nights when the pallet scorched my bare body and sleep would not come. I hear her hushed, soothing voice, I am safe with her once more. My own mother could hardly have been kinder or more tender than simple, superstitious Kippa, at whose hands blind and crippled storytellers were sure of a good meal. The stories pleased me, but as a counterweight there was the lively street, that haunt of flies, the street that was filled with 1,000 scents and smells. From the harbor the wind would bring the fresh tang of cedarwood and myrrh, or a breath of perfumed oil when a noble lady passing in her chair leaned out to curse the street boys. In the evenings, when Ammon's golden boat swung down to the western hills, there arose from all the nearby huts and verandas the smell of fried fish mingled with the aroma of newly baked bread. This smell of the poor quarter in Thebes I learned to love as a child, and I have never forgotten it. It was during meals on the veranda that I received the first teachings from my father. He would enter the garden wearily from the street or come from his surgery with the sharp odor of ointments and drugs clinging to his clothes. My mother poured water over his hands, and we sat on stools to eat while she served us. Sometimes while we were sitting there, a gang of sailors would reel along the street, yelling drunkenly, beating with sticks upon the walls of the houses, or stopping to relieve themselves by our acacias. My father, being a discreet man, said nothing until they had gone by. Then he would tell me, only a Negro or a dirty Syrian does that in the street. An Egyptian goes between walls. Or he would say, wine enjoyed in moderation is the God's gift to us, and rejoices our hearts. One beaker hurts no one. Two loosen the tongue, but the man who drinks a jar of it wakes to find himself in the gutter, robbed and beaten. Sometimes a breath of perfumed ointments would reach the veranda when a lovely woman went by on foot, robed transparently, with cheeks, lips, and eyebrows beautifully painted, and in her liquid eyes a glint never seen in those of the virtuous. When I gazed spellbound upon such a one, my father would say gravely, "Beware of a woman who calls you pretty boy and entices you, for her heart is a net and a snare, and her body burns worse than fire." It was no wonder that after such teachings my childish soul began to fear the wine jar and beautiful women who were not like ordinary women. Though both became endowed with the perilous charm of feared and forbidden things, while I was yet a child, my father let me attend his consultations. He showed me his scalpels, forceps, and jars of medicine and explained their uses to me. When he examined his patients, I had to stand beside him and hand him bowls of water, dressings, oil and wine. My mother could not endure to see wounds and sores and never understood my interest in disease. A child does not appreciate suffering until he has experienced it. To me, the lancing of a boil was a thrilling operation, and I would proudly tell the other boys all I had seen to win their respect. Whenever a new patient arrived, I would follow my father's examination and questions with close attention until at last he said, "This disease can be cured, or I will undertake your treatment." There were also those whom he did not feel competent to treat. Then he would write a few lines on a strip of papyrus and send them to the house of life, in the temple. When such a patient had left him, he would usually sigh, shake his head, and say, "Poor creature." Not all my father's patients were needy. Patrons of nearby pleasure houses were sent to him now and again to be bandaged after some brawl, and their clothes were of finest linen. Masters of Syrian ships came sometimes when they had boils or toothache. I was not surprised, therefore, when the wife of a spice dealer came for examination one day wearing jewelry and a collar sparkling with precious stones. She sighed and moaned and lamented over her many afflictions while my father listened attentively. I was greatly disappointed when at last he took up a strip of paper to write upon, for I had hoped he would be able to cure her and so acquire many fine presents. I sighed, shook my head, and whispered to myself, "Poor creature." The sick woman gave a frightened start and looked uneasily at my father. He wrote a line in ancient characters copied from a worn papyrus scroll, then poured oil and wine into a mixing bowl and soaked the paper in it until the ink had been dissolved by the wine. Then he poured the liquid into an earthenware jar and gave it to the spice dealer's wife as a medicine, telling her to take some of it whenever head or stomach began to pain her. When the woman had gone, I looked at my father, who seemed embarrassed. He coughed once or twice and said, "Many diseases can be cured with ink that has been used for a powerful invocation." He said no more aloud, but muttered to himself after a time, "At least it can do the patient no harm." When I was 7 years old, I was given a boy's loincloth and my mother took me to the temple to attend a sacrifice. Ammon's temple in Thebes was at that time the mightiest in all Egypt. An avenue bordered with ram's-headed sphinxes carved in stone led to it, right through the city from the temple and pool of the moon goddess. The temple area was surrounded by massive brick walls and with its many buildings formed a city within the city. From the tops of the towering pylons floated colored pennants, and gigantic statues of kings guarded the copper gates on each side of the enclosure. We went through the gates, and the sellers of books of the dead pulled at my mother's clothes and made their offers shrilly or in a whisper. Mother took me to look at the carpenters' shops with their display of wooden images of slaves and servants, which, after consecration by the priests, would serve their owners in the next world so that these need never lift a finger to help themselves. My mother paid the fee demanded of spectators, and I saw white-robed, deft-handed priests slay and quarter a bull between whose horns a braid of papyrus bore a seal, testifying that the beast was without blemish or a single black hair. The priests were fat and holy, and their shaven heads gleamed with oil. There were 100 or so people who had come to attend the sacrifice, but the priests paid little heed to them and chatted freely to one another of their own affairs throughout the ceremony. I gazed at the warlike pictures on the temple walls and marveled at the gigantic columns, failing altogether to understand my mother's emotion when with tear-filled eyes she led me home. There she took off my baby shoes and gave me new sandals that were uncomfortable and chafed my feet until I grew used to them. After the meal my father, with a grave look upon his face, laid his big, clever hand on my head and stroked with shy tenderness the soft locks at my temple. "Now you are 7 years old, Sinuhe, and must decide what you want to be, a warrior," I said at once, and was puzzled by the disappointed look on his good face. For the best games the street boys played were war games. And I had watched soldiers wrestle and perfect themselves in the use of arms in front of the barracks and had seen plumed war chariots race forth on thundering wheels to maneuvers outside the city. There could be nothing nobler or grander than a warrior's career. Moreover, a soldier need not be able to write, and this was what weighed most with me, for older boys told terrible tales of how difficult the art of writing was and of how mercilessly the teachers pulled the pupils' hair if they chanced to smash a clay tablet or break a reed pen between their unskilled fingers. It is likely that my father was never a notably gifted man, or he would surely have become something more than a poor man's doctor. But he was conscientious in his work and never harmed his patients, and in the course of years had become wise through experience. He knew already how touchy and self-willed I was and made no comment on my resolve. Presently, however, he asked my mother for a bowl, and going to his workroom, he filled the vessel with cheap wine from a jar. "Come, Sinuhe," he said, and he led me out of the house and down to the river bank. By the quay we stopped to look at a barge from which stunted porters were unloading wares sewn up in matting. The sun was setting among the western hills beyond the city of the dead, but these serfs toiled on, panting and dripping with sweat. The overseer stung them with his whip while the clerk sat placidly beneath his awning, checking off each bale on his list. "Would you like to be one of those?" asked my father. I thought this a stupid question and gaped at him without answering. No one wanted to be like the porters. "They labor from early morning till late at night," said Senmet. "Their skins have coarsened like a crocodile's, their fists are gross as crocodiles' feet. Only when darkness falls can they crawl to their miserable huts, and their food is a scrap of bread, an onion, and a mouthful of thin, bitter beer. That is the porter's life, the plowman's life, the life of all who labor with their hands. Do you think they are to be envied?" I shook my head, still looking at him in wonder. It was a soldier I desired to be, not a porter, a scratcher of the soil, a waterer of the fields, or a dun-caped shepherd. "Father," I said as we went on, "soldiers have a fine time. They live in barracks and eat good food. In the evening they drink wine in the pleasure houses, and women smile at them. The leaders among them wear golden chains about their necks although they cannot write. When they return from battle, they bring with them booty and slaves who toil and follow trades to serve them. Why shouldn't I strive to become a warrior, too?" My father made no answer but hastened his step. Near the big rubbish dump where flies buzzed in a cloud about us he bent down and peered into a low mud hovel. 11 Inted, my friend, are you there? Out crawled a verminous old man leaning on a stick. His right arm had been lopped off below the shoulder, and his loincloth was stiff with dirt. His face was dried and wizened with age, and he had no teeth. Is that Inted?" I gasped, looking at the old man in horror. Inted was a hero who had fought in the Syrian campaign. Under Thothmes III, the greatest of the pharaohs, and stories were still told of his prowess and of the rewards that Pharaoh had given him. The old man raised his hand in a soldier's salute, and my father handed him the bowl of wine. Then they sat down on the ground, for there was not even a bench outside the hut, and Enteb raised the wine to his lips with a trembling hand, careful not to waste a drop. My son Sinuhe means to be a warrior, my father smiled. I brought him to you, Enteb, because you are the last survivor of the heroes of the great wars and can tell him of the proud life and splendid feats of soldiers. In the name of Set and Baal and all other devils, cackled the other, turning his nearsighted gaze upon me. Is the boy mad? His toothless mouth, dim eyes, dangling arms stumped, and wrinkled, grimy breast were so terrifying that I crept behind my father and gripped his arm. Boy, tittered Enteb. If I had a mouthful of wine for every curse I have uttered upon my life and upon fate, miserable fate that made a soldier of me, I could fill the lake that Pharaoh has had made for his old woman. True, I have never seen it because I cannot afford to be ferried across the river, but I doubt not I could fill it, and that there would be enough over to fuddle an army. He drank again, sparingly. But, said I, my chin quivering, the soldier's profession is the most honorable of all. Honor. Renowned, said Enteb, hero of the armies of Thothmes. Dropping Zorger where flies are bred, no more. Many a lie have I told in my time to get wine out of the goggling blockheads who listen to me, but your father is an upright man whom I will not deceive. Therefore, son, I tell you that of all professions the warrior's is the most wretched and most degraded. The wine was smoothing out the wrinkles in his face and kindling a glow in his wild old eyes. He rose and gripped his neck with his one hand. Look, boy. This scraggy neck was once hung with golden chains, 5 loops of them. Pharaoh himself hung them there. Who can reckon the lopped-off hands I have heaped before his tent? Who was the first to scale the walls of Kadesh? Who burst through the enemy ranks like a trumpeting elephant? It was Enteb the hero. And who thanks me for it now? My gold went the way of all earthly things, and the slaves I took in battle ran away or perished miserably. My 12 right hand I left behind in the land of Mitanni. And I should long ago have been begging at street corners were it not for the charitable people who give me dried fish and beer now and then for telling their children the truth about war. I am Enteb, the great hero. Look at me. I left my youth in the desert, robbed of it by starvation, privation, and hardship. There the flesh melted from my limbs, my skin toughened, and my heart hardened to stone. Worst of all, the parched desert dried my tongue, and I became the prey of unquenchable thirst, like every other soldier who returns alive from foreign wars. And life has been like the valley of death since I lost my arm. I need not so much as mention the pain of the wound and the agony when the army surgeon scalded the stump in boiling oil after the amputation. That is something your father can appreciate. Blessed be your name, Senmet. You are a just man, a good man, but the wine is finished. The old fellow fell silent, panted a little, and sitting down again upon the ground, he turned the earthenware bowl sadly upside down. His eyes were glowing embers, and he was once more an old, unhappy man. But a warrior need not know how to write, came my faltering whisper. Said the old man and looked sideways at my father, who quickly took a copper bangle from his arm and handed it to him. Enteb called loudly, and at once a grimy boy ran up, took the ring and the bowl, and started for the tavern after more wine. Not the best, shouted Enteb to him. Get the sour, they'll give you more of it. He looked at me again reflectively. A warrior need not write, only fight. If he could write, he would be an officer with command over the most valiant, whom he would send before him into battle. Anyone who can write is fit for command, but a man who cannot scribble pothooks will never have even so many as 100 under him. What joy can he take in gold chains and honors when it is the fellow with the reed pen in his hand who gives the orders? Thus it is, and thus it will be, and so, my lad, if you would command men and lead them, learn to write. Then those with the gold chains will bow down before you, and slaves will carry you in a chair to the field of battle. The dirty boy came back with a jar of wine and had the bowl full as well. The old man's face shone with joy. Your father Senmut is a good man. He can write, and he tended me in my palmy days when wine was plentiful and I used to see crocodiles and hippopotamuses where none were. A good man, though he is only a doctor and cannot handle a bow. He has my thanks. I stared nervously at the wine jar to which Int had plainly meant to turn his full attention and began to tug at my father's wide, drug-stained sleeve, fearful lest so much wine might result in our waking, bruised and beaten, in some gutter. Senmut looked at the jar also, sighed a little, and led me away. Int had lifted up his shrill old voice in a Syrian song while the naked, sun-blackened boy laughed. So I buried my martial dreams and no longer resisted when my father and mother took me next day to school. My father could not afford to send me to any of the big temple schools where the sons, and sometimes daughters, of rich men, nobles and eminent priests were taught. My teacher was the old priest Anna who lived not far away and held classes on his tumble-down veranda. His pupils were the children of artisans, merchants, dock foremen, and non-commissioned officers whose ambition sought to open a scribe's career for their sons. Anna had in his time been steward to the celestial mood in the temple and was therefore well fitted to give elementary writing lessons to children who later on would be keeping tally of merchandise, measures of grain, head of cattle, or provisions for the army. There were hundreds of such little schools in the great city of Thebes. Instruction was cheap, the pupils merely having to maintain the teacher. The charcoal seller's son replenished his brazier in winter, the weaver's son kept him in clothes, the corn chandler's boy saw that he never ran short of flour. And my father treated his many aches and pains and gave him herbal anodynes to take in his wine. His dependence upon us made Anna a gentle teacher. A boy who fell asleep over his tablets never had his ears boxed. He had but to filch some titbit for the old man next morning. Sometimes the corn merchant's son would bring a jug of beer. On such days we were all attention, for old Anna would be inspired to tell us strange stories of the other world, of the celestial mood, of the Creator, of Ptah and his companion gods. We would giggle, believing that we had distracted him from our difficult tasks and wearisome writing characters for the rest of the day. It was only later that I perceived old Anna to be a wiser teacher than we took him for. There was a purpose in his recital of the legends to which his pious, childlike spirit gave life. They taught us the traditions of ancient Egypt. In them no evil deed went unpunished. Relentlessly each human heart was weighed before the 14-high throne of Osiris. That mortal whose evil deeds were disclosed upon the scales of the jackal-headed one was thrown to the devourer, who was crocodile and hippopotamus combined, but more terrifying than either. He told also of the surly backward gazer, that dread ferryman without whose help no one could attain the fields of the blessed. When he rowed, he faced aft, never forward like the earthly boatmen of the Nile. Anna would make us repeat by heart the phrases with which this being might be bribed and propitiated. He taught us to copy them out and then write them down from memory, correcting our faults with the gentle warning that the smallest error would wipe out all chance of a happy life in the hereafter. Were we to hand the backward gazer a letter containing even a trivial mistake, we should be forced to wander like shadows for all eternity by the banks of those somber waters, or, worse still, be engulfed in the hideous abysses of the realms of death. I attended Anna's school for some years. My best friend there was Thothmus, who was a year or so older than myself and who had been brought up 12 from infancy to wrestle and to handle horses. His father was leader of a squadron of chariots and wielded a whip of office braided with copper wire. He had hopes that his son might become a high-ranking officer and therefore wished him to learn to write. But there was nothing prophetic about the illustrious name of Thothmes, despite his father's ambitions, for as soon as the boy began his schooling, he ceased to care for javelin throwing and charioteering. He learned his characters easily, and while the other boys struggled grimly with them, he drew pictures on his tablets, pictures of chariots, rearing horses, and wrestling soldiers. He brought clay to school, and while the ale jug told stories through Anna's mouth, he modeled a comic little image of the devourer snapping with clumsy jaws at a little bald old man whose humped back and pot belly could belong to none other than Anna. But Anna was not angry. No one could be angry with Thothmes. He had the broad face and short, thick legs of a peasant, but his eyes held a joyful glint that was infectious, and the birds and beasts he formed from clay with his clever hands delighted us all. I had sought his friendship first because he was soldierly, but the friendship persisted after he had ceased to show a trace of warlike ambition. A miracle happened during my school days, and happened so suddenly that I still remember that hour as one of revelation. It was a fair, cool day in spring when the air was full of bird song and storks were repairing their old nests on the roofs of the mud huts. The waters had gone down, and fresh green shoots were springing from the earth. In all the garden seeds were being sown and plants bedded out. It was a day for adventure, and we could not sit still on Anna's rickety old veranda, where the mud bricks crumbled under one's hand. I was scratching at those everlasting symbols, letters for cutting in stone, and beside them the abbreviated signs used for writing on paper, when suddenly some forgotten word of Anna's, some queer flash within myself, spoke and brought these characters to life. The pictures became a word, the word a syllable, the syllable a letter. When I set picture to picture, new words leaped forth, living words, quite distinct from the symbols. Any yokel can understand one picture, but two together have meaning only for the literate. I believe that everyone who has studied writing and learned to read knows what I am trying to say. The experience was to me more exciting, more fascinating than snatching a pomegranate from a fruit seller's basket, sweeter than a dried date, delicious as water to the thirsty. From that time I needed no urging but soaked up on as learning as dry earth soaks up the flood waters of the Nile, and I quickly learned to write. In a little while I began to read what others had written, and by the third year I could already spell my way through tattered scrolls and read aloud instructive fables easy for the others to write down. About this time I noticed that I did not look like the rest. My face was narrower, my skin lighter, and my limbs more slender than those of the other lads and of the people among whom I dwelt. But for the difference in dress, hardly anyone could have distinguished me from the boys who were carried in chairs or walked the streets attended by slaves. I was sneered at for this. The corn merchant's son would try to put his arm round my neck and called me a girl until I had to jab him with my stylus. He revolted me for he had an evil smell, but I liked to be with Thothmes, who never touched me. One day Thothmes said shyly, "I will model your likeness if you will sit for me." I took him home, and there under the sycamore he made a likeness of me in clay and scratched the characters of my name upon it with the stylus. My mother Kippa, coming out with cakes for us, was badly frightened when she saw the image and called it witchcraft. But my father said that Thothmes might become artist to the royal household if he could only join the temple school. And jokingly I bowed down before Thothmes and stretched forth my hand at knee level as one does in the presence of distinguished persons. His eyes shone. Then he sighed that it could never be, for his father thought it was time he came back to barracks and joined the school for charioteers. He could already write as well as was required of any future officer. My father left us then, and we heard Kippa muttering to herself in the kitchen. But Thothmes and I ate the cakes, which were greasy and content. I was still happy then. The day came when my father put on his newly washed best robe and set about his neck a broad collar embroidered by Kippa. He went to the great temple of Ammon, though privately he had no love for priests. But nothing ever happened in Thebes or indeed in the whole of Egypt at this time without their help and intervention. They administered justice so that a bold man against whom judgment had been given by Pharaoh's own court could appeal to them for redress. In their hands lay all instruction for the higher administrative posts. They foretold the height of the flood waters and the size of the harvest, and from this assessed the taxes for the whole country. I do not think it can have been easy for my father to humble himself before them. All his life he had been a poor man's physician in the poor man's quarter, a stranger to the temple and the house of life, and now, like other penniless fathers, he had to wait in line outside the administrative department until it should please some holiness or other to receive him. I can see these poor fathers now, squatting in the temple courtyard in their best robes, dreaming ambitious dreams for their sons, for whom they coveted a better existence than their own. Many of them had come a long way on river boats. Carrying their food with them. They spent their substance on bribes to doorkeeper and clerk for the privilege of a word with a gold-embroidered, perfumed, and anointed priest, who wrinkled his nose at the smell of them and gave them harsh words. And yet, Ammon stands in continual need of new servants. The greater his wealth and power, the greater the numbers of scribes he wears out in his service. However, there is not a father who does not regard it as a divine favor for his son to be received into the temple, though in bringing the boy he brings a gift more precious than gold. My father was fortunate in his visit, for noon had scarcely passed when his old fellow student Tahir came by. In the course of time Tahir had become skull-opener to Pharaoh's household. My father ventured to address him, and he promised to honor our house in person and inspect me. The day being fixed, my father saved up for a goose and the best wine. Kippa baked, and nagged. A luscious odor of goose fat floated out into the street till blind men and beggars gathered there to sing and play for their share of the feast. Kippa, hissing with rage, charged out with a bit of bread dipped in the fat for each of them and sent them packing. Thothmas and I swept the street from our door far into the city. My father had asked Thothmas to be at hand when the guest came, in the hope that he also might be favored with the great man's attention. Boys though we were, when my father lit the censer and set it to perfume the entrance way, we felt as awestruck as if we had been in a temple. I guarded the can of scented water and kept the flies off the dazzling white linen cloth Kippa had set aside for her own burial, but which was now brought forth as a towel for Tahir. We had long to wait. The sun set, and the air grew cooler. The incense in the porch all burned away, and the goose sizzled sorrowfully in the roasting pit. I grew hungry, and Kippa's face lengthened and stiffened. My father said nothing but would not light the lamps when darkness fell. We all sat down on stools in the porch and avoided one another's eyes. And it was then I learned what bitter grief and disappointment the rich and mighty in their thoughtlessness can bring upon the poor. But at last there came the glow of a torch along the street. My father jumped up and hastened to the kitchen for an ember to light both the lamps. I raised the water pitcher in trembling hands while Thothmas breathed heavily beside me. Tahir, the opener of royal skulls, arrived unpretentiously in a chair borne by two Negro slaves and preceded by a fat torchbearer who was evidently drunk. With puffings and cheerful cries of greeting Tahir stepped from the chair to hail my father, who bowed and stretched forth his hands at knee level. The guest laid his hands on Senmet's shoulders, either to show him that ceremony was needless or to steady himself. Thus supported he kicked at the torchbearer and told him to sleep it off under the sycamore. The Negroes, without waiting for orders, dumped the chair in the acacia bushes and squatted on the ground. Still leaning on my father's shoulder, Tahir stepped into the porch, where I poured water over his hands despite his protests. When I handed him the linen cloth, he said that as I had rinsed his hands I might now dry them. When I had done this, he thanked me and said I was a handsome boy. My father led him to the seat of honor, a chair with a back, borrowed from the spice merchant, and he sat down, his inquisitive little eyes peering about him in the light of the suet lamps. For a time there was silence. Then, clearing his throat apologetically, he asked for something to drink as the long journey had made him dry. My father, delighted, poured out wine for him. Tahir sniffed at it and tasted it suspiciously, then emptied the cup with evident enjoyment and gave a contented sigh. He was a bow-legged, shaven-headed little man with a breast and belly that sagged beneath a thin robe. His collar, set with precious stones, was now soiled like the rest of his dress, and he smelled of oil, wine, and sweat. 18 kippas served him with spice cakes, small fish fried in oil, fruit, and roast goose. He ate politely, though it was clear that he had just come from a good meal, and he tasted and praised every dish to Kippa's great delight. At his desire I took beer and food to the Negroes, but they returned the courtesy by shouting insults and asking whether old Swag Belly was ready to go. The servant snored beneath a sycamore, and I had no wish to wake him. The evening grew extremely confused, as my father, too, drank more than I had ever seen him do, so that at last Kippa, sitting in the kitchen, was overcome with woe and sat rocking back and forth with her head in her hands. When the pitcher was empty, they drank father's medicinal wine. When that was gone, they started upon ordinary table beer, for Tahir assured us that he was not particular. They talked of their student days in the House of Life, swaying and embracing each other as they sat. Tahir related his experiences as royal skull surgeon, affirming that it was the last branch in which any physician should specialize, being more suited to the House of Death than the House of Life. But there was little work attached to it, and he had always been lazy, as Senmet the Tranquil would certainly remember. The human head, except for the teeth, ears, and throat, which required their own specialists, was in his view the simplest thing to study, and so he had chosen it. But, said he, if I had had any decency I should have remained what I was, an honest physician bringing life to his patients. As it is, my lot is to deal out death when kinsfolk grow weary of the old or the incurable. I should be like you, friend Senmet, poorer perhaps, but leading a more honest, a more wholesome life. Never believe him, boys, said my father, for Thothmas was sitting with us now and held a small wine cup in his hand. I am proud to call Pharaoh's skull boarder my friend. In his own line he is the most highly skilled in all Egypt. Do I not remember the prodigious trepanning operations by which he saved the lives of mighty and humble alike and astonished the world? He releases evil spirits that drive men to madness and takes their round eggs from men's brains. Grateful patients bestow gold and silver upon him, chains and drinking cups. But grateful kinsfolk have done more, put in Tahir thickly. For if by chance I heal 1 in 10, 1 in 15, no, let us say 1 in 100, so much more certain is the death of the others. Have you heard of a single pharaoh who lived 3 days after his skull had been opened? No, the mad and incurable are put under my flint knife, and the richer and more illustrious, the quicker they come. My hand releases men from pain, divides inheritances, land, cattle, and gold. My hand raises pharaohs to the throne. Therefore they fear me, and none dares speak against me, for I know too much. But what increases knowledge increases sorrow, and I am a most unhappy man. Tahir wept a little and blew his nose on Kippa's shroud. You are poor but honest, Senmet, he sobbed. Therefore, I love you, for I am rich and rotten, rotten, a lump of ox dung upon the road. He took off his jeweled collar and hung it about my father's neck. And then they began to sing songs whose words I could not understand, though Thothmus listened with interest and told me that riper songs were not to be heard even in barracks. Kippa began to weep loudly in the kitchen. One of the Negroes came over from the acacia bushes, lifted Tahir in his arms and would have carried him to his chair, for it was long after bedtime. But Tahir struggled and uttered pitiful cries, called upon the watchman to help him and vowed that the Negro meant murder. As my father was of no help, Thothmus and I drove the Negro off with sticks until he flew into a rage and went, swearing violently and taking comrade and chair with him. Tahir now emptied the beer jug over himself, asked for oil to rub on his face, and tried to bathe in the pool. Thothmus whispered to me that we ought to get the old men into bed, and so it came about that my father and the royal skull surgeon fell asleep on Kippa's bed with arms about each other's necks, slobbering oaths of eternal friendship to the last. Kippa wept and tore her hair and sprinkled herself with ash from the roasting pit. I was tormented by the thought of what the neighbors would say, for the roaring and racket had sounded far and wide into the still night. Thothmus was placid, however, for he had seen wilder doings in barracks and in his father's house when the charioteers talked of the old days and of the punitive expeditions into Syria and the land of Cush. He contrived to quiet Kippa, and after we had cleared away the traces of the feast as best we could, we, too, went to bed. The servant snored on beneath a sycamore, and Thothmus lay down beside me in my bed, put his arm about my neck, and talked about girls, for he also had drunk wine. But I found this wearisome, being a year or two younger than he, and soon fell asleep.